kind of models that we're using for trauma are largely based on Western conceptions of trauma like PTSD. And most people who are working in the field of psychology have found that these conceptions don't really fit with the experiences of people, both in our contexts across the continent. And I think if we're going to really help the people we're working with, if we're going to respond to the lived experiences of people, we need to rethink what trauma means from their perspective.
C'est effectivement important pour un psychologue clinicien qui est en contact avec les problèmes de trauma, de traumatisme, et qui est en contact avec les personnes qui souffrent psychiquement, de se poser des questions. Et cela est très important. Premièrement parce que les concepts ont été conçus en Occident dans un contexte particulier. C'est vrai que c'était aussi un contexte de guerre, de première guerre, de deuxième guerre mondiale. Mais en même temps, les choses ne se passent pas de la même façon. Dans le sens que le contexte africain post-indépendance est très différent. Et particulièrement celui de la République démocratique du Congo, où depuis l'indépendance, nous ne cessons d'avoir des conflits armés qui ont commencé dès les années 60. Et les derniers conflits qui ont débuté dans la décennie 90 ne sont qu'un prolongement de toute une série de conflits. Et donc, nous pouvons dire que le peuple congolais a été traumatisé dans son ensemble, mais particulièrement les provinces de l'Est, la République démocratique du Congo, ont été récemment traumatisées pendant une vingtaine d'années. Mais en même temps, les populations n'ont pas été traumatisées seulement par la guerre et ses conséquences, les viols, les violences sexuelles, les déplacements de population, l'incendie des villages, toute une série de réfugiés qui sont allés dans les pays voisins ou même plus loin. Mais ils ont été aussi traumatisés par le fait de l'incurie du gouvernement, des différents gouvernements qui se sont succédés dans le pays, et en même temps de la présence permanente des forces de l'ONU, de l'encadrement des forces de l'ONU, mais qui ne semble pas arriver à terminer le conflit totalement. On sent toujours qu'il y a quelque chose de résiduel qui reste, qu'il y a des groupes armés qui continuent à terroriser la population. Et donc, nous ne pouvons plus réfléchir en termes seulement de concepts tels qu'ils ont été définis en Occident, mais en même temps, nous devons réfléchir sur un traumatisme généralisé pour une population culturellement diversifiée et qui réagit donc différemment des autres populations, qu'elles soient occidentales ou d'autres continents.
Violence and issues of HIV are not just an individual act or an individual experience. They are part of a systemic issue, challenge that we have. So to address emotional well-being as one single person's challenge is to be naive, especially as we're discussing reconceptualizing trauma.
Psychological distress is man-made in that sense, and often man-made. So if we're going to look at alleviating psychological distress, we've got to look at the political. But I suppose what is different for us is that we're looking at it, we're starting with the individual and working outwards from the individual. So as the individual finds some kind of inner resource, reclaims some kind of hope, some kind of sense of agency, starts acting on the environment differently, it affects the social environment and it can lead to political change.
Our key insights about working with trauma creatively is also about us as an organization being bold enough to say that the people that we work with, the individuals and communities and families that we work with, experience complex, continuous trauma. And therefore, this notion of working with trauma as a once-off event, that we do 1 or 2 debriefing sessions and then, ta-da, have a nice life, it doesn't work for us. And we have been able to be bold enough in the field to be able to say it doesn't work. We need to know that there's a flow of different traumas that affect people. And some people just learn to cope with ongoing trauma in their lives, and we need to hold them and walk with them and journey with them through the ins and the outs of the different traumas that they face, and not work with trauma as a single event and an unexpected event, like we were taught when we were trained that trauma is a sudden, unexpected event that has got the ability to horrify the person, and the person feels endangered, and you work with it 1, 2, 3, you're done. We have been able to be creative and say, you know what, we need to walk with people through the different levels of trauma and through the different traumas that they face, because sometimes it's just one thing after another which is traumatic.
People don't have these discrete experiences of trauma. They experience trauma all the time. At the moment, there's this, in the field of psychology and psychiatry, there's this huge debate about, do you deal with the daily stresses, which in poor communities is around food, is about shelter, is around education, access to healthcare, or do you deal with past trauma, which, for example, in the inner city community is usually around war. It's about the war rapes in Bukavu and Goma. It's about what children have witnessed. It's about the long journey to South Africa. It's about the xenophobic trauma. So do you deal with that, or do you deal with the daily stresses? We find we need to deal with both at the same time, all the time. For example, at the end of the month, you don't get a client to speak to you about their experiences in Goma, because at the end of the month, they're worried about where they're going to get rent from. And so you try and hold the daily stressor, and you try and do quite practical problem solving. Around about the 14th, you can talk about other things, or they bring up other things, because at least for a few days, that pressure could be off. And so it's constantly holding the past trauma, the daily stresses, and recognizing that the daily stresses are actually traumatic, that they are also trauma. Eviction is a trauma. Displacement doesn't only happen because of war in the Congo. It happens within that ghetto all the time. Because people can't pay rent, then they get evicted, then they go and share a room with another family, and so almost every month the family could move. That is displacement, and that is traumatic. So within the landscapes of suffering, and all we can do is, in those landscapes of suffering, provide those islands of safety, so that when people come to us, they feel welcome, they feel heard, they feel that their suffering is affirmed, they feel that they can find some kind of hope. Sometimes I think we are a hope factory. We create hope out of nothing. But of course, everybody has inner resources, and it's accessing those inner resources that creates the hope, and that then helps us to manufacture hope for carrying on living.
The reason why we need to really conceptualize trauma is because the elites defined it within the concept of you going into a certain room, and you sit there with the expert, and then you go through some questions. Whereas we know that very few of us, and especially women who have been abused, can really have the resources to move to those town-centered trauma centers. I think we need to break this whole monotony of, if you are traumatized, you need to be in a certain space. You must be seen by a psychologist and a psychiatrist. Yes, that is vital. But in reality, it is important the world knows that, especially here in Africa, I've seen so many women who have never gone to school, but they sit with you and they talk to you, and there are some rituals they do and they heal people. So why do we think that it is only medicinal, it is only Western oriented? We have even healed some Western oriented because of the way we understand trauma to be removing pain out of this person. And of course, if you are removing pain, you can remove it from different ways. I can dance, I can sing, I can hug, I can cry, I can sit and cite poems. There are many forms, and we just need to, the world just needs to know that the world has changed, manifestations are different, the violations are different, and why should we keep it as it was? We need to change.
There are a lot of people, ordinary people, uneducated people, who are doing a lot of healing at community level. Where is their voice? What framework are they using? How much are they connecting with the processes that all of us are having to go through? So for me, it's really about placing it to the ordinary person, linking it to our ordinary work, and seeing the value that all this is bringing, and developing our own data, our own methods that speaks to the experiences, because sometimes you actually wonder whether this framework actually speaks to my experience. So it is critical.
The reason we are doing prevention of violence is really to address trauma, even if we are not addressing it from a clinical psychologist angle or from a counseling, direct service provision. I have been intrigued by the discussion that the whole continent is in trauma to begin with. But I think for those of us who are living in this patriarchal setting, and some settings are more deeply entrenched in patriarchy than others, the issue of trauma is very real on two fronts. Once you're doing transformative work, you really need to recognize the issue of trauma. You're not just trying to transform systems and structures, you're also trying to deal with trauma that is intergenerational. But also, if you do prevention work, I think it is also your responsibility to ensure that there are services of good quality. And the discussion on reconceptualizing trauma for me means that we're talking about services that are relevant for the women in this context and that are going to make meaningful change in their lives. And that then drives back to the work on prevention. If we have shifts in the lives of survivors, shifts in the lives of those around the survivors, we then can have shifts in the social norm change or prevention work that we are doing.